My name is Tobias Ball. I am one of the managing form and style editors. I'm very glad you're all here today and have taken the time to enroll and then to show up, because there's going to be some really valuable information here. Like you probably just heard, we are recording this session so you can come back later and review it. I was saying in an earlier session that I'm the kind of person who likes to hear something once, maybe take some notes, think about it, and then come back and verify. And what's really nice is because this will live as an artifact on our Form and Style website, if you are in the process of writing your proposal or your final study or even a course paper and you have a grammar question, you recall that you heard some information here, you can pop back in and replay the recording. I'm particularly excited about grammar. I think that a lot of this session will actually demystify grammar. I get the idea sometimes that when people hear the terms grammar or APA, they treat it, like I said earlier, like it's maybe like trigonometry, right? Or something that's very out of reach and difficult. When really I want us to think about grammar as something we use every single day. When you're talking, when you're writing, when any sort of communication, you're using grammar. So what you'll get today is just an explanation for what you're already doing. And I think you're going to be one of the best about this. So a couple logistical things. There's a lot of information in this session. It ends at 10:45 Central Time, so in about 45 minutes. We do our best to have a Q&A at the end, but if we reach that 45-minute marker and there isn't time for Q&A, you can always email editor@mail.waldenu.edu. Or after you meet the presenting editor or any of us today, you're welcome to send us an email and we can answer a question for you. But there will be plenty of resources available. There is a chat function, and our coordinating editor, Denise Long, will be in there answering questions. However, if you find the chat to be distracting, like it might pop up with questions while you're kind of listening to the session, you can just click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and close out that chat window so you won't see it. To introduce our editor presenter, I will hand things over to my managing colleague, Dr. Kelly Shermack. Kelly.
Thanks, Tobias. Hello, everyone. I'm Kelly Shermack. I am the other Form and Style managing editor. Welcome to this session on grammar in the Capstone. As Tobias mentioned, I think we've got an exciting and informative session in store for all of you. And to present this, we do have our senior editor, Dana Harrington, who has a background in several masters in French and English and has taught English in various different countries across the globe. And she's kind of an expert in, multilingual writing and writing from different languages and learning English. So she is the perfect editor presenter for this session. Dana, I will hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Kelly. I'm just going to pop on here to chat, just a wave on video, and then I'm going to go off video. I just want to make sure to save my bandwidth, but I wanted to say hello on video. So welcome. This session is called Grammar in the Capstone, Back to the Basics. And just to kind of get us going a little bit, in today's session, I have it broken down into kind of 4 different categories. So we're going to start off by talking about what grammar is and why it matters. And then from there, we're going to go on to some review of English sentence structures, as well as a little bit of punctuation with sentence structures, because that seems to be a common error that we see in capstone studies as we're editing. And then from there, we're going to move on to a few other common grammar errors that we find in the capstone. Sentence fragments, sentence run-ons, parallel structure, verb tense, and subject-verb agreements. And then we'll end today with a few tips of how you can revise for grammar in the capstone study. There's so much more we could do with this. I feel like we could take every little grammar point and spend, an entire day on it. So this is really going to be a quick overview. And I did want to mention, like Denise had posted in the chat, the slides should be available in the chat. Throughout this presentation, I do have quite a few hyperlinks to different that I'm going to talk about. So I do advise you to download the slides, have those hyperlinks for yourself for a later point, and then you can kind of go back to things that you have more questions about afterwards. So let's go ahead and just kind of get going. So what is grammar? Well, that really depends on who or whom you ask. A common or popular understanding of the term grammar is that grammar is a set of prescriptive rules for language use to be learned and followed. So people sometimes refer to either good grammar or bad grammar and judge others on how well they adhere to those purported rules. The linguistic definition of grammar, though, is a little bit different from the popular common definition. And linguists then will say that grammar is really neither good nor bad. A sentence is either grammatical, which means that it works, or it is ungrammatical, meaning that it doesn't work. This grammatical correctness then is really socially constructed. So it's kind of based on the people around you and what you're able to understand, when communicating with the people around you. Another thing I think that's important to think about when we think about the linguistic function of grammar is that variation over time and space is inevitable. So in other words, what I mean by that is language continues to evolve. It has always evolved, it will continue to evolve, though people largely adopt the grammar of those around them or those who they aspire to associate with. So why does this matter? Well, I find as an editor and as a writer that the linguistic definition of grammar can be really helpful in writing the doctoral capstone because it still respects the writer's own voice and style when appropriate. And I think it's something for you to think about as you go to write your capstone, thinking about the grammar that you choose in order to write your doctoral capstone. Again, perceived grammatical correctness is really contextual. So what is judged as incorrect or bad grammar in some contexts could be just fine in other contexts. So in different styles, different registers, different dialects, whether you're talking to a lawyer or your grandma, whether you're trying to write a persuasive essay or an email, all of these things can change the grammar that you use. Down below here, I say to consider some examples, and I'm going to show you 3 different examples. And in these examples, there's only one of them. It's one with an asterisk that is really a truly ungrammatical sentence according to this linguistic definition of grammar. So the first example here I have is, you probably ain't never really had trouble understanding double negatives. So you might have learned, as an elementary student not to write and use double negatives. But if you read this sentence, it makes sense, right? You understand what I'm saying. And so this would be an example of a sentence that would be grammatical according to the linguistic definition of grammar, but you'd want to choose which context you end up using the sentence in. The next example I have is, some argue that a preposition is not a good word to end a sentence with. Of course, the sentence ends with a preposition, right? But once again, this linguistic definition of grammar shows us that this sentence is really, it's understandable, which means it is, grammatical. It works in certain styles and registers. This next example with the asterisk is really the only ungrammatical sentence. Still, sentences are not grammatical if followed certain rules, not are, right? So this sentence doesn't work in terms of either the prescriptive definition of grammar or the linguistic definition of grammar. It doesn't make sense because it doesn't follow English word order. So all that to say then, there are multiple grammatically correct possibilities that exist to express a given idea, but some of these possibilities might be more clear than others or more conventional than others for the context. In this case, as you're writing your doctoral capstone at Walden, you're trying to write in academic English. And that then is the aim of grammar in the capstone study. So the next 2 slides that I want to show you show some common grammar errors in writing, and these are listed in order of frequency and significance to the possible impact on clarity within the written text. I wanted to mention that these lists have come up, they came from an author and researcher named Dana Ferris, and she's studied and published a lot on grammatical errors in student writing. And she kind of noted what is the most common grammar errors to the least grammar errors. So that's kind of what I have here. Note as well on this slide and on the next slide, I've included lots and lots of hyperlinks and references to the APA manual, because really, again, like I mentioned at the beginning of the session, we could spend a whole session discussing each one of these concepts by itself. As a capstone writer, I think it's important to understand these terms, kind of know what they are, so that you know what to look for in your own writing as you think about kind of common errors. So the first thing up at the top of the slide will be errors with sentence structure. And we're going to spend a bit of today's session talking about that. Simple, compound, complex sentences, as well as compound complex sentences that I don't have listed here. Kind of as a subsection under sentence structure are issues with parallel construction. And that goes back to the AP manual as well. Relative, restrictive, and non-restrictive clauses. So that's whether like a clause or a phrase is essential information in the sentence or non-essential information that changes the punctuation of the sentence. And dangling or misplaced modifiers. Those would also fit under sentence structure problems. The next kind of main bullet point here, it has to do with punctuation. And punctuation, I think, is really, really related to sentence structure itself. So you want to think about punctuation, especially to avoid sentence fragments and run-ons. And then specifically in terms of punctuation, commas and semicolons are kind of the two biggies, right? So commas become important, especially when they can change or obscure the intended meaning of the text. And semicolons are important as well. Word choice is the next bullet point here, and I referred back to the APA manual and a couple sections there that talks about APA word choice specifically. Verb tenses is another one, and we'll spend a little bit of time on that today. And then verb forms is the next one. And so I've hyperlinked out here to a couple of blog posts we have about gerunds and infinitives. So gerunds would be like when you've got the ing form of the verb, like reading, versus the infinitive to read, and when you'd use those different verb forms. So this next slide gives some more common grammar errors to understand, which again can be helpful as you write and revise your Capstone manuscript. So word forms is the next one I have on here. So parts of speech. So like if it's a noun, verb, adjective, adverb, and being able to identify what part of speech it is. Subject verb agreement is the next one, and that's something we're going to talk more about today. I think this becomes especially important when you've got complex subjects where the head or the subject itself is not adjacent or next to the verb. So when the subject and the verb are kind of separated by a clause or a phrase, then that becomes more tricky. Also, is in terms of APA, words like data or criteria or phenomena, which are plural, versus criterion and phenomenon, which are singular. Noun endings, that would be like when you've got like an S at the end of a word to make something plural, or thinking about count versus non-count nouns, right? Pronouns would be another one. Articles is listed here as well. So that would be like a, an, and the. And if you're a multilingual writer, that might be something that you've had to work on. Prepositions is another one. That would be like in, at, on, things like that. And finally, I listed spelling at the bottom here. I added spelling because Dana Ferris, the researcher, did include spelling as a common error. But I just wanted to mention some other researchers might not consider spelling an actual grammar error, but more a part of mechanics. I still thought, though, it might be worth including. And especially thinking about spelling and APA, which is the documentation style you use to write the capstone at Walden. When you're thinking about spelling at Walden, you want to keep in mind that spelling often follows the Merriam-Webster dictionary, which is what is linked here. And spelling then also follows American English and not British English, not Canadian English, not Nigerian English, things like that. Because Walden is, even though it's an online global institution, it is founded or kind of housed in the United States. So your spelling should represent that as well. All right, so because sentence structure issues are really at the very top of common grammar errors in writing, I wanted to start there and look a little bit at English sentence structure basics. So these seem really simple, but I think they're worth mentioning because when you start breaking down sentences and making sentences more complex, being able to kind of break up a sentence into the different parts can be really helpful to make sure you have everything you need for a grammatical sentence. So a new sentence begins with a capital letter. So we've got an example here. Other researchers reported similar results, and that O and other here is capitalized. That makes sense, right? We've all learned that. The second one here is a sentence ends with punctuation. So a period, a question mark, or an exclamation point. So same sentence here, other researchers reported similar results, ends with a period. The third point here is a sentence contains a subject that is only given once. And this might differ from other languages. I know that in some languages you can repeat a subject. In English, we only give that subject once. So my example here is other researchers, they reported similar results. So here you could either say other researchers reported similar results, or you could say they reported similar results, but you don't want that double subject. Just one subject here is what English sentence structure uses. All right, kind of continuing on then, a sentence also contains a verb or a verb phrase. In this case, we've got reported as our verb. Other researchers reported similar results. An English sentence follows subject, verb, object, word order. So again, other researchers, subject, reported, verb, similar results, object. In English, we don't speak like Yoda, right, in Star Wars. And so we follow the subject, verb, object, word order. And then finally, a sentence must have a complete idea that stands alone. And this is also called an independent clause. So if you've ever heard, the term independent clause, dependent clause, that's what they're talking about. An independent clause is a sentence. And so again, other researchers reported similar results is an example of an independent clause or a complete simple sentence. All right, well, we can take then these simple sentences or these independent clauses and we can combine them into compound sentences. If you make a compound sentence in your writing, it's really a stylistic choice that can give the writing a bit more sentence variation and to really help keep that reader's interest. So to combine simple sentences into compound sentences, you can do two things. One thing you can do to combine these simple sentences, is to use a semicolon. So the example on the slide here says, interviews are one way to collect data, semicolon. They allow researchers to gain an in-depth understanding of participants. So here again, we've got two simple sentences. Interviews are one way to collect data is one simple sentence. They allow researchers to gain an in-depth understanding of participants. That is another simple sentence. We can put these together with a semicolon. Makes it a compound sentence, just makes it a little bit more interesting, possibly, than just putting a period there. Another thing we could do to make a compound sentence is you can use a comma and a coordinating conjunction. Coordinating conjunctions, you might have heard of the acronym fanboys. So fanboys would be for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. And so you can use a comma and a coordinating conjunction and put these two simple sentences together. So here in the same example, I have interviews are one way to collect the data, comma, and they allow researchers to gain an in-depth understanding of participants. So again, we've got two simple sentences here, but in this case, we've used a comma and a coordinating conjunction to combine them. So either way you combine these sentences is grammatically correct. It's really a stylistic choice. You could also leave these as separate sentences, but giving your writing some sentence variation can be really helpful for your readers and make your writing more interesting to read. All right, another way to create sentence variety is to use complex sentences. So a complex sentence then combines an independent clause, remember that's a simple sentence, and a dependent clause. And this is also a stylistic choice that I mentioned before you can use for sentence variation. So once again, just to review, an independent clause contains a subject and a verb and is a complete sentence. A dependent clause, you also might have heard this referred to as a subordinate clause. It contains a subject and a verb, but it is not a complete sentence by itself. So a dependent clause or subordinate clause has to be attached to an independent clause somehow. Here are a few examples of dependent or subordinate clauses. Because I used a phenomenological research design, blah, 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 when participants describe their perceptions, or so that interviews could verify the accuracy of my interpretations. So all of these examples are, again, examples of dependent or subordinate clauses. These aren't complete sentences by themselves. They have to be attached to something else. So if you're writing a complex sentence, which is again a dependent and independent clause, one thing to think about is punctuation and what you're doing with punctuation in these complex sentences. So if you start a complex sentence with a dependent clause followed by an independent clause, you're going to use a comma after that dependent clause. So my example here says, because employee turnover is expensive, comma, it is necessary to explore strategies managers use to maintain a low rate of turnover. So in this sentence, again, because employee turnover is expensive, that is our dependent clause. It cannot stand alone. And then we've got our independent clause. It is necessary to explore strategies managers use to maintain a low rate of turnover. Again, dependent clause, comma, independent clause. However, say we turn this sentence around and we say independent clause plus dependent clause. In this case, there is no comma. So here I have, it is necessary to explore strategies managers use to maintain a low rate of turnover because employee turnover is expensive. So in this case, I've just swapped this dependent and independent clause, and now I do not put a comma in between them. So again, just kind of to verify, pay attention to punctuation if you're making complex sentences and what you're putting first. Dependent clause, comma, independent clause, or independent clause, dependent clause, no comma. All right, let's move on. Another way that we can create some sentence variety is to use compound complex sentences. So now we're putting a few different sentence types together. So compound complex sentences contain at least two independent clauses and at least one dependent clause. Just like the previous slide about complex sentences, it's important to pay close attention to comma usage and other punctuation as well in these, because that could obscure the meaning for your reader if it's mispunctuated. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. This first one I have is, because employee turnover is expensive, comma, I explored strategies managers use to maintain a low rate of turnover, comma, and I discovered 4 themes. So to kind of break this down further, our one independent clause here is because employee turnover is expensive. And now I've got 2 independent clauses. I explored strategies managers use to maintain a low rate of turnover. That's one of them. I discovered 4 themes. That's another one. And I put these 2 independent clauses together with a comma and a coordinating conjunction. That would be a compound sentence, right? And so now we've got this compound complex sentence. All right, here's another example. I conducted interviews with managers, comma, and I reached saturation after 9 interviews, even though I had originally scheduled 12 interviews. So here I put that dependent clause at the end rather than at the beginning. So at the beginning, now I've got my 2 independent clauses. I conducted interviews with managers, that's one independent clause. I reached saturation after 9 interviews, that's another independent clause, stuck together here with a comma and a coordinating conjunction. And then I finished the sentence with a dependent clause, even though I had originally scheduled 12 interviews. Note the punctuation again here. In the second example, there is no comma before even though, right? Because it's the same as what we just saw on the previous slide. If you've got this, if you've got an independent clause followed by a dependent clause, no comma. Alternatively, in this first example, because employee turnover is expensive, there's our dependent clause before the independent clause, so we stick a comma there. I've hyperlinked out here to a little bit more on comma usage as well. So if that's something that you feel like you need to go back and review again on your own, you can click on that hyperlink in the slides that Denise has sent out. All right. So now that we've looked at some various sentence structures, let's take a look at a few common errors with these sentence structures. One of the most common errors that we see in Capstone documents is errors with sentence fragments. So a sentence fragment lacks one or more necessary component of a sentence, and or it does not express a complete idea. Here's an example. The participants who signed the consent form. So this sentence is missing a predicate. This is not a complete sentence. So there's lots of ways we could revise this. Here's the possible revision I came up with. The participants who signed the consent form were contacted for an interview. So now I've added a predicate. Now this is a complete sentence, no longer a sentence fragment. Here's one more example. A task force to study potential causes for the rising rate of diabetes, comma, and members will work with the community to seek a solution. So this sentence is missing a verb that's associated with the subject. So here, again, this is an example of a sentence fragments. And there's a couple of ways we could revise it. Well, there's multiple ways we could revise it, but I'm going to show you two possibilities for revision. One is that we could make this a simple sentence, but we could add that missing verb. So you could say, members of a task force to study potential causes for the rising rates of diabetes will work with the community to seek a solution. So now we have this missing verb, and we've got all the parts of an English sentence, right, that we need to make this complete. One more possibility, if we want to make the sentence maybe a little bit more complex, more interesting, is to make it a compound sentence. So here I wrote, a task force has convened to study potential causes of the rising rates of diabetes, comma, and members will work with the community to seek a solution. Again, either one of these is fine, but just somehow we have to get a verb that's associated with the subject, so that you've got a complete English sentence. All right. Looking at this next slide, another common error that we'll see with sentence structure is with run-on sentences. And a run-on sentence occurs when there's more than one sentence joined together improperly, usually with no punctuation or with not appropriate punctuation. So an example here of a run-on sentence is, participants could leave the study at any time they needed to indicate their preference. So in this case, we've got two independent clauses here. We've got two sentences, but there isn't any punctuation that shows that these are two different sentences. There's lots of ways you could revise it. Here's what I did. I just made this two simple sentences. Participants could leave the study at any time, period. They needed to indicate their preference, period. So now I've just made this two simple sentences instead. I could also make this a compound sentence, make it a little bit more interesting. Participants could leave the study at any time, semicolon, they needed to indicate their preference. In this case, I've just put that semicolon there between those two parts of the sentence and now made it a compound sentence. On this next slide, I wanted to show you an example of a more complex run-on sentence and some possible revisions, because I think sometimes run-on sentences, like you can see them when they're really simple, but when they get more complex, it's sometimes hard to figure out what's going on. And so I think that that's when it becomes important to think back to those English sentence structure rules and what appears in an English sentence. So being able to kind of break that down into the different parts. I don't know if you like tree diagrams. I always found those fun, but you know, I might be the only one. But if you kind of take a look at that, if you can break down your sentences and figure out what's happening in different parts, then you can figure out how to correct an error with it. So here's an example of a run-on sentence that's more complex. Employee morale has a big impact on productivity, comma, therefore, comma, because job satisfaction plays an important role in turnover, comma, managers should value the employee's emotional needs. All right, so there's again more than one independent clause here. And when we've got more than one independent clause, we've got to do something to differentiate between these parts of the sentence. So here's a possible revision where I made this a simple sentence and then a complex sentence. I could say employee morale has a big impact on productivity, period. There's a simple sentence. Therefore, comma, because job satisfaction plays an important role in turnover, comma, managers should value the employee's emotional needs. So that therefore sentence, that's an example of a complex sentence. We've got this dependent clause followed by an independent clause. Another possible revision to make this a compound complex sentence would be to do something like this. Employee morale has a big impact on productivity, semicolon. Therefore, comma, because job satisfaction plays an important role in turnover, comma, managers should value the employee's emotional needs. So again, here's an example of a compound complex sentence, putting it together with a semicolon, and kind of breaking these sentences up into the parts that they need to be. All right, fun stuff, right? Okay, let's look at one last example with of a common sentence structure error, and that has to do with parallel structure. So one other thing to keep in mind with sentences is that they should be parallel in structure. What I mean by this is that all ideas being compared should have the same grammatical structure. So adjectives with adjectives, verbs with verbs, nouns with nouns, and so on. An example here of a problematic sentence with parallelism is this one. In this chapter, I explain the research design, the rationale, and describe the variables. So here I've got three things being compared: research design, rationale, and variables. But you'll see that these aren't all set up in the same way. And so there's a problem here with parallelism, which leads to difficulty in clarity, right? As a reader, it makes me kind of trip up a little bit because I'm trying to figure out what the writing says. So a possible revision here would be to make these parallel in structure, again, keeping the same grammatical structure. So you could say instead, in this chapter, I explain the research design, the rationale, and the variables. In this case now, the research design, the rationale, the variables, those are all nouns. So I've kept these comparisons parallel in structure. One other example I want to give here, because this is one that I see a lot in capstone studies, is an example with a not only but also sentence. So she is not only a teacher, but also coaches girls basketball. So here we're really comparing two things, being a teacher and coaching girls basketball, but the two parts of the sentence are not parallel in structure. So to revise this, we could say something like this. She is not only a teacher, but also a girls basketball coach. So again, I made both of these now nouns, a teacher, a girls basketball coach, made them parallel in structure. One other thing I wanted to note with this not only but also sentence is that there is not a comma before the but in this sentence. And the reason why is because this is not a compound sentence with a coordinating conjunction, right? It's not two sentences that are put together as a coordinating conjunction. It's one sentence, it's one simple sentence. So that but here doesn't function the same way as it does like in a compound sentence. So there's no comma. And I'll see that quite a lot as I'm editing capstone documents. Up at the top of the slide, I did also hyperlink parallel structures, so you can see more examples up there if you are curious and interested in more examples, more explanations, things like that. All right. Well, at this point then, let's move away a little bit from sentence structures and take a peek at another common grammatical error in the capstone, and that has to do with the verb tenses. So depending on the grammar book that you're looking at, there are 12 to 16, depending verb tenses in English. But there are really three tenses that you use the most often in academic writing. That would be the simple present tense, like I research, the simple past tense, which is I researched, and the present perfect tense, I have researched. The next most common tense for capstone writers is the future, like I will research. And you'd use this specifically when working on the proposal of your capstone study. So the simple present tense, we use this to describe like a general truth or a habitual action. The statement is generally true in the present. So for example, you could say research methods include qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods. The sentence is generally true in the present, and so we're using this simple present tense. The simple past tense or the present perfect tense, these we use for the literature review and also for a description of procedures. The simple past tense is used to describe results in the study. And there's a blog post that I've hyperlinked here about choosing the present perfect in academic writing. We also have more information on our website about when you choose the simple past tense versus the present perfect. Those would be things to kind of go back to again on your own if this is something that you're struggling with a little bit. But to kind of give you a really brief overview of this, that simple past tense, we use this to describe a completed action that took place at a specific point in the past. So 2 hours ago, last year, etc. My example here is Carlson 2023 conducted the interviews and then transcribed them. So in this sentence, you'll see that there are two verbs, conducted and transcribed, and both of these are in the simple past tense. These are completed actions, and they took place at a specific point in the past, in this case, 2023. right? So they're done, they're finished. The present perfect tense, alternatively, we use this when we're trying to indicate that an action took place in the past at a non-specific time, but the action has some kind of relevance in the present. So in this case, I have previous researchers have addressed the same topic. Note here that there is not a specific time frame. It doesn't say previous researchers have addressed the same topic in 2023, right? Because again, the present perfect does not have a specific time frame. So it's something though that took place in the past, but has some kind of relevance in the present. And that's when we end up using that. One other thing, or a couple of other things I wanted to talk about is a few more specifics about APA and verb tense. One of them is that APA has some specific guidelines on verb tenses as well. APA section 4.12 specifically says that the writer needs to refer to previous research in the past. So here we would say Jones 2022 found, stated, presented, discovered, proposed, claimed, asserted, commented, highlighted, and so on. I wanted to point this out because APA is different from, say, MLA, where you would refer to research in the present. So in MLA, you'd say something like Jones finds, Jones states, things like that. But in APA, it's got to be referred to in the past because that's what APA dictates. Another couple specifics that has to do with verb tense is when you're referring to the document itself, if you want to preview what is coming in the document or explain what is happening at that moment in the document, you want to use the present or the future. So you could say, for example, in the next chapter, I describe or I will describe the methods used. Alternatively, if you're referring back to information that you've already covered, such as summaries or discussions that have already taken place, or if you're writing a conclusion to a chapter or a section, you're going to use the past tense. So here you'd say, in summary, in this section, I highlighted previous research in the past. A few other last considerations with verb tense is that when you are going from writing your proposal of your document to the final study, you might have to change and update some verb tenses. And I want to point this out because sometimes people or writers will think, okay, you know what, I'm done with my proposal, I finished it, it's been approved, I never have to look back at it again. And then they go to write their discussion and conclusion sections and submit it, and they think it's good to go. But in fact, what happens then is you've got, chapters 1, 2, and 3, or sections 1 and 2, depending on what you're writing in the future, and then you've got those last sections in the past, and then your document isn't really aligned and it isn't cohesive because it reads kind of as two different parts. So remember that verb tenses need to be revised from the proposal to the final study as appropriate. So if you're writing the proposal, you might say, in this study, I will employ face-to-face interviews with key participants. But then now you're done with the study, you're going to have to go back to that same sentence and you're going to want to revise that. In this study, I employed face-to-face interviews with key participants. So just a reminder here that you do need to go back and revise some of those verb tenses from proposal to final study as needed. One last thing that has to do with verb tenses and APA is about consistency in tense. So APA says that you want to use verb tenses consistently and stay within the chosen tense to ensure smooth expression. In other words, you don't want to shift verb tenses unnecessarily because these can be really confusing for the reader. That said, there might be times when a shift within a sentence is appropriate. And I've hyperlinked out to a page about that as a conjunction for noun clauses where I describe this a little bit further. But just to kind of give you a brief overview of this, one use of the word that in a sentence is for embedding or inserting certain types of dependent clauses, also known as noun phrases, into an independent clause. And these dependent clauses then serve as the direct object of a reporting verb, like found, reported, posited, argued, claimed, maintained, hypothesized. And you can use these then to introduce a paraphrase or a summary or a quotation. And when you do this, when you use these that clauses, it might be appropriate to shift the verb tense within these types of sentences. A couple of examples where you're going to see this shift are on the slide here. So I have Taylor found that the participants drink an average of 2.2 cups of coffee per day. So notice in this sentence, you actually have two different verb tenses. You've got found in the past and you've got drink in the present. And although APA says you don't want to shift tenses unnecessarily, in this case, you have to, right? So Taylor found that that's when you're using that as a conjunction for a noun clause. It's kind of like almost like your introductory clause to the sentence. And because APA says you have to refer to previous research in the past, that's what we've got here. Survey participants drink an average of 2.2 cups of coffee per day. Now we're changing this to the present tense, because remember, we're using the present for kind of habitual actions or general truths. And survey participants always drink, these cups of coffee per day. This is a general truth in the present. So you're using the present tense. One more example, that same idea. The researchers explained, past, that identifying a cause will be difficult because we've got that clause here. We go from past tense to, in this case, future. I'm looking at the time here and I'm going to kind of scoot on out of this, but if you've got more questions about that, go ahead and click on that hyperlink when you get the slides and read more about it. Let's then take a look at one last common grammatical error, and that has to do with subject-verb agreement in the capstone. And so again, while this might seem really simple, I think it becomes a lot more tricky when the subject and the verb are separated by another phrase in the sentence. So remember that the subject and the verb must agree in numbers. So when a phrase comes between the subject and the verb, that verb still needs to agree with the subject, not the noun or the pronoun in the phrase following the subject of a sentence. So my example here I have is, interviews are one way to collect data and allows researchers to gain an in-depth understanding of participants. My subject in the sentence is interviews, right? And my verb here is allows. Well, interviews is plural and allows is singular, so that doesn't work, right? So to revise this, I might say, interviews are one way to collect data and allow researchers to gain an in-depth understanding of participants. Again, if the subject is interviews, the verb has to be plural, allow. So even though interviews and allow aren't right next to each other, you want to make sure that that subject and verb still agree, even if there's like a phrase or a clause in between them. One more example. The nurse who normally works with pediatric patients volunteer at the blood drive every year. So here we've got the nurse, that's our subject, and volunteer is one of our verbs. And you can see here that these don't align. So possible revision, the nurse who normally works with pediatric patients volunteers at the blood drive every year. So if the subject here is the nurse, that's singular, the verb volunteers must also be singular. So as you're going back to your capstone document, check for those subject-verb agreement errors, especially when there's a phrase between that subject and the verb. Just for time, I'm going to skip over this slide because you will be able to go back to it again. But I gave on this slide 6 different bullet points of ways that you can go ahead and revise your own capstone document for grammar. And all of these have some different hyperlinks in them. So I do really encourage you to go back to these on your own again. Take your time, spend the time on what you need to do here, but these are some tips for you. One other thing I wanted to point out is we also have some blog posts on grammar in the capstone, and these are also hyperlinked here. So if these are anything that you have difficulty with, you can always take another peek back at those. We don't really have time for questions, but like Tobias said at the beginning of today's presentation, you can always email us at editor@waldenu.edu and ask us follow-up questions that you have about the presentation today. And so at this point, I will turn it back to Kelly, I believe.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dana, for a wonderful presentation. Really informative. And I know some of you are probably like, whoa, that was a lot of information, and it was really great stuff. But like Dana mentioned and Tobias mentioned, this is something to review and go back to. And I liked how, Dana, you really closed it out saying, here's a way to go back and revise what you've done. It's hard to keep all of these kind of rules in your mind as you're writing, but as you go back and proofread and revise, maybe you're implementing feedback from a second committee member or your chair, maybe kind of read through some of these slides and kind of prime your brain to be watching for some of these grammar not really necessarily errors, but just things that might pop out at you that you can revise or clarify or explain as you're revising. It might just be helpful, especially if you know grammar, as English grammar is an area where you might struggle. The link to the presentation or the PDF, I think Denise posted it a couple of times, so it should be there. She also put in some links to the smart guides. Just overall, thank you so much, Dana, for a really great presentation. Thank you, Tobias, and to Denise also for being here and supporting us through these sessions. Yeah, we appreciate your attendance. And remember, we've got 2 more sessions this afternoon, one again at the top of the hour. So you've got a 15-minute break. That is the writing, organization, and structure for the capstone. Denise just put a link in the box. So if you haven't already registered, you can still do that. And just remember, it will be in a different link or different meeting room. So if you stick around here, you will be alone. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll hope to see you in the next presentation.